Thank you, Jamie, for inviting me to preach and lead today. I will admit to you all that it's been a little while since I've had the chance. In February of 2024, I joined the staff of what is now known as Presbyterian Life and Witness, an agency of the General Assembly of the PCUSA. That's a mouthful, I know. In other words, I'm on staff with the denomination. I am the manager for preparation for ministry and exams for the whole denomination, which means I spend a lot of my time talking with those who are discerning a call to ordained ministry. I have a lot of conversations about call and vocation, both the particular call of ordination to worship and to the word and sacrament in general, and in general, the call that God has placed on each one of our lives. These conversations happen with presbyterians, synod leaders, seminary staff, those who are actually in the process to become ordained. They happen with my colleagues in leader development and members of committees and commissions on preparation for ministry. So very late in the week, when it dawned on me that 2 of this week's lectionary texts were call stories, I needed to make a shift. The call of Matthew and the call of Abram seemed too good of an opportunity to pass up. Now, I have a certain fondness for this story in Genesis. It's the very first text I ever preached when I was in seminary, many years ago. And 20 plus years on, I can't necessarily tell you how I chose to preach this story back then, but the story still amazes me now, the way that it did all those years ago as a young person trying to figure out what God was calling me to do and who God was calling me to be. If the story is to be believed, God said for Abram to go, and Abram went. That's it? No protest? No discussion? No family meeting? No listing the pros and the cons of leaving or staying? If any of those things happened, we're not told. All we have to go on is the story on the page, and I think there are a few important things to notice. It isn't just that the Lord told Abram to go, the Lord told Abram to leave everything behind, to leave the place that he knew like at the back of his hand, the place that was most familiar to him, to leave his tribe, to leave his livelihood, the things that occupied his days. We're not told, but I'm guessing that Abram and Sarai were comfortable in their life. I'm guessing they didn't really have any plans to leave their hometown and everything they knew and held dear. I'm guessing they weren't looking to make a big change. And the Lord comes along and says, you've got to go. Pack it all up, let go of everything that's familiar to you, and just go. I promise it'll be worth it, but you might not live to see that promise fulfilled. I've got long-term plans for you and your family, and you're just going to have to trust me. That feels like a lot to take in. And notice, too, that Abram was not necessarily a young man. We are told very specifically that he was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. This is a late-in-life move, a third chapter shakeup, a no time like the present opportunity, invitation, command, call. It's a call that God laid before Abram's feet. And the astonishing thing is, Abram went. I have this picture in my mind of Abram and Sarai and Lot and all of the people that they had acquired, all of their belongings strapped to pack animals, moving through the harsh land like Old Testament clampets. And we have to remember that they didn't actually know where they were going. God hadn't shown them yet. God didn't feel like they needed to know anything other than it was time to move forward in a new direction. Now, I find that when it comes to big life changes, most of us want directions. We want a big arrow pointing the way that we ought to go. We want a checklist and a map and maybe some kind of instruction manual. Or at least we think that that's what we want. When we look at the biblical narrative, though, we see that sometimes, even when instructions or directions are explicit and clear, that human beings are still not satisfied. Abram, it seems, did just as he was told, but Moses argued with God. Jonah literally took off in the other direction from where God told him to go. Saul got impatient with God and lost his throne to David. So maybe directions, or lack thereof, are not the point. They are the excuses we use when we're hesitant about following where God calls. I'll follow wherever you lead, Lord. Just show me the way first. I'll follow wherever you lead, Lord, but surely someone else would be better suited. Surely someone else knows what they're doing more than I do. I'll follow wherever you lead, Lord, as long as it's not to that place or to those people. I will follow wherever you lead. Just don't ask me to give up X, Y, or Z. I will follow wherever you lead, Lord, in my own good time. As it turns out, we human beings are usually pretty good at placing limits around God's call. And that's what, to me, makes Abram so incredible. Matthew's gospel offers us another call story, one that I think is just as astonishing. Here, too, there are a few things we should notice. Matthew was minding his own business, literally, when Jesus happened by. The text says that Jesus saw Matthew sitting at the tax booth and said to him, out of the blue, "Follow me." Follow me. And I suspect that Matthew, like Abram and Sarai, was comfortable in his life. He was not unoccupied. He had things to do, and as I understand it, he had a pretty lucrative gig at that tax booth. We're not told, of course, but we can guess that Matthew wasn't looking for a big change in his life either. Or maybe he was, and that's just not a part of the story. Even when we know that things in our lives need to change, we are often reluctant to do anything about it. Change isn't usually a welcome thing. We do know that Matthew wasn't looking for Jesus, but Jesus was looking for Matthew. And that, like Abram, Matthew would need to leave some things behind in order to follow where Jesus called. Preacher and professor Reverend Dr. Cleophas LaRue says that God never calls us to something without first calling us away from something. That sounds a bit to me like the old life has gone and the new life has begun. It is remarkable that Abram and Matthew didn't argue with God about the massive shift their lives were about to take. They didn't offer any buts. They didn't outline their inadequacies or their lack of skills or knowledge. They didn't insist on conditions or claim age or gender or attachments as reasons why they couldn't do what they were being called to do. They didn't seem to worry about what others would think or consider that their actions might disappoint someone. Abram didn't even check with his own family before saying yes to God. I'm not sure that's always the way to go, but that's how things went in that particular tale. If the biblical narrative is to be believed, there's not a lot of prep time when it comes to following where Christ calls. It seems that when God calls, it's on-the-job training that is most preferred. It didn't matter that Abram and Matthew didn't know where they were going or what they would be doing. God would provide everything they needed along the way. It didn't matter either that these two may not have been the best candidates for the job. Matthew, in particular, was probably considered a pretty objectionable choice for a disciple. A despised tax collector isn't necessarily the first person we think of when it comes to faithfulness and discipleship. So it's a good thing Jesus wasn't looking for someone who looked good on paper. Jesus was looking for someone who would follow, and everything else would come in time. And the thing is, God doesn't usually wait until we feel worthy or ready or equipped or prepared before calling us into some new thing. What it all comes down to in the end is this: do we trust God with our future? Abram seemed to, and so did Matthew. Abram trusted God with a future that he wasn't going to see in his own lifetime. And Matthew had no idea what was ahead of him when he got up from his tax booth and followed Christ. We know because we've read the stories. We know that their paths were not straight. We know that their ways were filled with challenge and heartbreak. We know that they failed at points along the way. We know that their faithfulness had its limits, though God's never did. They didn't know what would come to pass, especially not in their respective moments of decision. In those moments, they trusted that God would travel with them to new and unknown places. They trusted that God's faithfulness would never waver, even when their own did. They trusted that their futures were safely in God's hands. And when God calls us, not if, when, we have a choice to make. Just one choice. Will we follow? Yes or no? There's no way to partially follow God's call. And not making a choice at all is its own choice. It's usually a default no. Sometimes God gives us a destination, and other times God doesn't. Sometimes God gives us clear instructions, and other times God doesn't. Sometimes we do feel ready to go, prepared, equipped, and other times we don't. None of that matters, though, in the end. It all comes down to trust. Trusting God with our future, whatever that future may be. Trusting that God will provide what we need along the way. Trusting that God is with us no matter what. Now, the call stories we read in Scripture may or may not actually seem applicable to our lives, particularly when we feel settled or set, or for whatever reason we assume that God is just done calling us into new things. These stories remind us, though, that God can and does call us into new life at any time. And we should not forget that we are all called to follow Jesus daily. Follow me, Jesus said to Matthew. Follow me, Jesus says to us. That's a choice we make every single day. And though we might assume that the call of God is only about something as big as ordination or a new vocation or something else that shifts the very ground upon which we stand, sometimes the new thing we're being called to isn't anything dramatic at all. It might be that we are called to use our time, our energy, our resources in new ways. It might be that we are called to interact with and build relationships with people who are strangers to us. It might be that we are called to love more deeply to see others more fully, to consider a different point of view. Each of these would involve a shift of some kind. Each of these would require us to let go of some things. Long-held routines, firm mindsets, or particular ways of being. Both Abram and Matthew had to leave their past behind in order to trust God with their future. Reverend Dr. LaRue again says this: you can never get to the next thing that God has for you until, in an act of simple obedience, you let go of where you are and follow him. It's that letting go part that can be the hardest thing, I think. I don't think, though, that God ever stops calling us. I don't think God ever stops calling us to be more of who we are created to be. I don't think God ever stops calling us to live more fully as beloved children of God. There are times when God calls us into something new as individuals, and there are also times when God calls us to something new as whole communities. Discernment plays a role in all of it. Discernment is one of those big, lovely, spiritual, churchy words that we may or may not fully understand. In our tradition, we believe that discernment happens in community, that groups of Christ followers praying together, listening together, learning together can hear the voice of the Spirit. We don't really see an example of that kind of discernment as we read the stories of Abram and Matthew. Their decisions were quick. And though sometimes we might be able to shift just as quickly, more often than not, discernment takes time. These are all things that we would do well to talk about more often in our communities of faith. Although I've learned this morning that you are talking about these things in this community of faith, and I am grateful. What does it mean for us to be called by God? What does it mean for us to discern together the movement of the Spirit? How do we talk about call and vocation, not just the big things like ordination, but the everyday things about choosing to follow Jesus? How do we talk about and tell our stories of call? How does this community tell its story of call? The ways in which our call shifts and changes over time as God calls us into new ways of being and doing. Now that we've read and heard 2 stories about call today, do you think you could share your own? Could you tell Covenant's story of call? I hope so. Amen.